Welcome everyone. Great to see you all here. Thanks for joining us. Can already see familiar faces and others I don't know. So delighted to have you here. We're going to have a very open conversational evening, a sort of short presentation to start with, and then we'll have plenty of time for conversation and questions and answer later. To get us started, you'll probably know just through the registration page that we're meeting today on the 10th Remembrance Day for Lost Species. And before I introduce our guest for the evening, Caroline Hickman, we're grateful to an 18-year-old musician called Rob Harrison and a mutual friend, his collaborator Amanda Brown, the artist Amanda Brown, who've made a 3-minute sound piece, especially for today, for this occasion, called Requiem for Lost Species. It would help if you had headphones, because it's an immersive sound. And apart from that, I will see you on the other side. Richard, thanks. Thank you, Rob and Amanda, for that. So I'm going to just start with the visual check-in for anyone who can't see the screen. I'm a white male in his 50s with short grey cropped hair and beard, wearing a brown jacket. I appear to have a string of fairy lights growing out of my left shoulder as I face the screen. And that's because I'm sitting in Falmouth University's chaplaincy room, which I knew would be quiet for the evening. I remembered these lights, so chose this space. I'm delighted to be joined by my Falmouth colleague and friend Zoe Young, who's a Falmouth University Pagan Chaplain. And Zoe and I have got many common interests in welcoming Caroline here that I'll speak to in a moment when I welcome Caroline. But first, Zoe's going to just ground us and bring us into this conversation. So welcome, Zoe.
Thank you. And I don't know if I can do that any better than those songs that we just heard. For anyone who can't see me, I'm a smallish female in glasses, also 50, so I have a candle beside me and a piece that is part of a project called To the Ends of the Earth, and it's made from things washed up by the beach. And I'm here in the southwest of England, in old nation of Kernow. And I would like us to remember that we are just the present skin of this planet. We are the present incarnation of the carbon-based life, of the water, the air, the earth, the fire. Same as the dinosaurs, the same as the anaerobic bacteria, our deep, deep ancestors who have all moved, crawled, danced, flown, swum around this planet before us. So without the loss of species, there would be no mammals. We would not have arisen. Our ancestors made it through the last 5 mass extinctions. This is just the way of life. So the way of death is embodied within the way of life. And I'd like to acknowledge those who've walked before us in these lands of Kernow, here at Falmouth, the mouth of the river, and this southwestern end of this island where the art.earth initiative is forming. And welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe.
I'm very excited to hear Caroline.
Yeah, as many of us are. I know there's many people here for whom Caroline's work has been really helpful these past 2 years. And as we were just saying to Caroline, the last time we spoke on screen was immediately before the pandemic when a few of us from Falmouth, Caroline came to join us here, and that really was the seed of this conversation. I'm also really delighted to be coming full circle from here in Falmouth, where our friend Dougal Hine gave the first of the Borrowed Time talks in summer 2019. There's lots that will come up. We'll look forward to hearing all of your questions. I just want to mention a common kind of concern that Zoe and I both noticed we arrived with, which is one of the things that we were particularly pleased about in ending with the talk from Caroline is that Caroline is speaking with and to and listening to the young. And I'm aware how often when I'm having these conversations, among the many ways we could talk about who's having them, they tend to be between myself and other people who are like me in the latter half of life. So I think it's really, really important in whatever way we can that we bring the whole question, not just speaking to, but listening to the young. And for Zoe and I, the whole conversation around ecological anxiety in the young, and not least the students who work with here at Falmouth University, is deeply entwined with the question of gaslighting. And I'd like to bring that into our conversation later. I won't expand on it now, but I'm just going to we're doing fine for time. We've got 2 minutes. So I promised Caroline we'd start by 15:15. So I promised Caroline I wouldn't do a kind of formal bio, but I really valued the short text that Caroline gave us just to situate this conversation. And I thought if I just read that and then introduce Caroline Hickman, a depth psychologist with an ecological awareness and closely associated with the Climate Psychology Alliance that many of you will know. Caroline says, as more of us turn to face the increasingly painful, hard to imagine truths of the climate and biodiversity crisis, we can find ourselves in deep water, struggling with broken or numbed hearts. We need shared spaces in which to call together the obscure hurt and sadness. Spaces in which we can feel the earth under our feet and listen to the grief and longing that surrounds us. Grief for who and what we have lost already, who and what we are losing now and will in the future. In remembering them, we can perhaps be reminded that we are, as Donna Haraway puts it, mortal critters entwined in myriad, unfinished configurations of places, times, matters, meanings. So I'm sure I speak for all of you in welcoming Caroline, and a reminder, I should have said earlier, as we're speaking, please do go ahead and start sending your questions to Richard Paval, stalwart colleague who's there in the background, and Richard will be taking your questions and feeding them through as we open it up. So welcome, Caroline. Lovely to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you for that. And Zoe, for that beautiful start this evening. That last remaining male bird calling for his mate nearly got me, I have to say. That calling into the emptiness. And I think, thank you for the introduction. I think, what am I doing at the moment? What I'm doing at the moment is trying to help without patronizing the voices of children and young people to be heard when they often feel, I think, that they're calling into the emptiness, and to try and help us bear them. I forgot to describe myself. I've just turned 60. I have very white hair. I'm sitting in front of a very messy bookcase, which, when I realized I was going to introduce this verbally to create a visual picture as well, I realized that some of the significant objects behind me on the bookcase are images of loss. There's a photograph of my father, who died 2 years ago, and myself when I was 2 or 3 years old in an oak tree. And I still think of oak trees as representing my father. So that photograph is behind me. There's images from my sister, from my family, as well as lots of books. A slightly darkened room, and out of sight are more green plants than probably should be fitted into a single room, trying to bring the outside in constantly. So the voices of children and young people, alongside the other mortal critters, the Donna Haraway description of us, trying to help them have their voices heard. And thinking about what grief means to bear, and bearing the sound of these children's voices, it can be very hard. And grief and loss resists being pinned down. It resists being named. So I thought the beautiful recording just resonated with loss and grief, but didn't specifically name it. Recently, I've been trying to pin it down, and I'll tell you why. And it's not my natural habitat at all, but I've been trying to pin it down because I don't think the stories always get through to everybody. I'm going to take a leap and think they are likely to get through to those of us who are here this evening, but they don't necessarily get through to everybody. So I wanted to try and communicate about this distress of children and young people facing the climate and ecological crisis to other people who could not hear stories but might hear numbers. So I'm going to start with some numbers, which, as I said, is not my natural habitat. And then I'm going to come to the stories and the voices of children and young people. And just to clarify, talking with children and young people globally about the climate and ecological crisis, I've been learning over the years, for them it has very, very little to do with environmental distraction and loss. Of course, there's grief and pain and despair and frustration and anger about that. But what makes it worse is the failure of adults to understand, the failure of people in power to listen and to hear what they're saying and take action, the failure to take that seriously. And one of the only ways to try and impact on those groups is with numbers, to quantify. And these are not just numbers, these are children speaking. But I'm going to give you some numbers. So we conducted a piece of research with 10,000, myself and an amazing group of colleagues, 10,000 children and young people in spring of this year. This was 1,000 children and young people in each of these countries: Australia, Brazil, Finland, France, India, Nigeria, the Philippines, the UK, and the US. And we asked them a lot of questions. We asked them how they felt, what they thought, how it impacted on their daily lives. And we looked for correlation with government action and inaction. I'm not going to go through lots of figures, but I want to just give a few. Over half of these children and young people polled, so this is 10,000 children and young people, over half told us that they thought humanity was doomed. This was 56% worldwide, 51% in the UK, and 73% in the Philippines. We asked them whether they thought the future was frightening. 75% of these children and young people in the world, it's a representative sample, 75% told us the future was frightening for them. 73% in the UK, 92% in the Philippines. We asked them whether they thought people had failed to take care of the planet. 83% in the world, 80% in the UK, 92% in the Philippines. What are we doing to those children and young people throughout the world, but especially in the Philippines? So if those are terrible, there's one last number I'm going to give you, which is even worse. 48% of these children and young people told us that they've been dismissed or belittled or told to shut up when they tried to talk about how they felt about climate change. So nearly half, when they tried to express this distress or this fear or these thoughts about the future, were silenced by us, by people. That's not okay, is it? That we can change tonight. So those are the numbers. So now I want to give you the stories, because in my view, children and young people are being born into grief around climate change. One of the most impactful conversations I had in recent years was with two young women who were midwives. And they were telling me that they couldn't help but cry as they handed babies over to joyful new parents. They were torn with the joy and the wonder and the beauty and the celebration of a new birth and a baby, much loved, much wanted, which they held this at the same time as feeling this enormous grief. The grief of the loss of the ideal, of the desired for future, of the naive optimism, of the painful awareness of what that child's been born into. And it's not about collapsing into it's all grief and horror and loss, or it's all wonderful and joyful. It's that tension of holding both, the despair and the joy at the same time. And this is what I think children and young people, I know I'm generalizing, so forgive me for that. This is what I feel that they're holding and embodying a lot of the time. A 10-year-old a few years ago got really cross with me. I was so glad he did, really, because he really got me to see something. He said, "No, Caroline, you don't get it." He said, "You think you understand," he said, "but you don't." He said, "You," meaning me, "grew up thinking that polar bears would be there forever." He said, "I've grown up knowing that they will go extinct." He said, "I've never had a day of my life where I've not known." He said, "The day I learned about what a polar bear was," he said, "I also learned to lose them, to say goodbye to them." So you have, again, that joy and connection and beauty and birth and learning and curiosity about the world juxtaposed with the grief and the loss. They are inseparable for these children. That was a child in the UK. Children in low-lying Pacific nations, Nigeria, Bangladesh, the Maldives, they're living with this daily now. It's already too late. Even if we went to zero carbon emissions tomorrow, which we're not managing to do, are we? It would be too late for the Maldives. It would be too late for Vanuatu, because the amount of carbon in the atmosphere means sea levels will continue to rise. We have to find a way to bear that. And the people living there have to find a way to bear that and live with that. It's a living loss, whilst still loving their beautiful country. 14-year-old in the Maldives said to me, he said, "Caroline," he said, "we saw online that people in Iceland had a funeral for a glacier." He said, "This is a beautiful ritual," he said, "but we're going to be underwater soon. Who's going to have a funeral for us?" Another child said to me in the Maldives, he said, "Climate change is like Thanos in the Avengers Endgame, whose ideology is to kill off half the world so the other half can thrive." He said, "But we're the half being killed off." So there's not just living with the grief, there's also this betrayal and abandonment and the knowledge, the conscious knowledge. These children that were saying this to me in the Maldives, they were calm, they were composed, they were reconciled. They understood this, that this was the decision the world was making, that there was conscious choice about this, that betrayal and abandonment. So many children talk to me about what it's like to live today as a child through their relationship with the other, with the other mortal critters, the Donna Haraway, the animals. And we encourage children in the West to develop empathy and relationship by relationship with animals. You know, we take them on bear hunts. We talk to them about rabbits, loving other rabbits. We teach about love through these relationships. So it shouldn't really confuse us that children and young people are feeling that pain and that grief of the even more silenced voices of the other critters. and feeling it as personal, and feeling that injustice and that unfairness on behalf of these animals, because they share that innocence. They share that sense of betrayal, that we're not saving them, we're not protecting them, we're not thinking about them. And they're very clear that their distress is not just about environmental distraction. It's about the fact that adults are not stepping in, not understanding, not listening, and not saving them. What I say to them, which is to some extent me trying to help them feel better and myself, but I hope isn't taking away their pain, but just being alongside them with that pain, is I say, well, actually, you only feel this because you care. And actually, you shouldn't be ashamed of caring. You could feel proud of the fact you care, because it's a good thing to care about this. So instead of getting anxious about your anxiety or distressed about this, let's be proud of this, and let's, stretch your heart, stretch your courage, and feel good about the fact that this hurts, but let's share that hurt so you're not on your own with it. I think that's what we need to be doing, trying to communicate that somehow. Another child said to me in the Maldives, he said, I'm really sad about climate change. He said, my friends are dying. And he paused and he looked at me and he said, my friends, the fish, are dying. Often for children and young people that, they are their friends. They're not just this other that we consume or protect or save or nurture or idealize. There's that sense of belonging in that vulnerability, I think, and in that innocence. So that's what I wanted to bring here this evening, and really so honored to be here this evening having this conversation with you. And thank you for making space for these children's voices. And even in this loss, speaking of this loss, I think there is beauty, and there's beauty in that understanding. And something soulful, I hope, remains that's important in hearing those children's voices. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. It's really such a powerful place to bring that round to for me at the end there. To affirm that grief, to affirm that loss, and so you shouldn't be ashamed of it. You should be proud of it because it shows you care. Something Rachel Clark said, Dr. Rachel Clark said in an earlier conversation, that the only answer for climate anxiety is to feel more of it. That kind of really came to mind. I wanted to own a little bit more that what I mentioned at the beginning, because I feel like there's something I need help with that I'm not clear on. On the one hand, I'm aware of a phenomenon which is people about my age, often of my demographic and kind of, middle-class professional male, who go around talking about everything's going to go to hell. There's a pattern to it that gives me a bad taste in the mouth, a distrust, a kind of offloading of stress by sort of dumping it on other people's heads. At the same time, I work in an institution where it seems to me, in the whole fabric of our education system, gaslighting is not simply what we're saying. It's in the fabric of the buildings we're part of. It's in the whole economic system of higher education. Young people coming in and taking on £54,000 debts and setting out for bright graduate futures where they'll pay them off. And I don't know how to handle that. I don't, how do we?
I just need to interrupt you slightly, Matt, because we're struggling to hear you a little bit.
Are you? Oh, okay.
Struggling to
Sorry.
hear you a tiny bit. I don't think it's
Sorry.
just me. Could you
I'll speak up. So yeah, I just the question that I roll up here with is very much how to address what I mean. I've started to think of it as implicit gaslighting, but it's like it's not just what we say or don't say; it's the whole way we're conducting ourselves. From the point of view of my friends for whom these emotions are all channeled into non-violent disobedience, it's the fact that every vice chancellor of every university in Britain isn't presently organising their entire campus to take part in the next mass civil disobedience. You know, we're just going along with it, and that to me is a deep form of gaslighting that then hands it back to the young and says, "Oh, you've got an issue with eco-anxiety. We can send you to a counsellor." That's not really a question, but that's just owning of what I turn up with. Sorry, I've been speaking quietly. I'll speak up.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind listening to you is, it hurts. It hurts to stay alive and awake to that caring and the reality of what we're doing and still do it. Because we are all still doing it. Our very lives are contributing to further environmental, ecological destruction. We don't have enough alternatives developed. So just every day we contribute to that, and we can take action to reduce that impact. But we are still making that contribution. And to stay alive and awake to that on an hourly, daily basis, it's painful. And I don't know, I have to struggle with guilt, culpability, responsibility. I gave the statistics, the whole statistics of the Philippines results in a webinar in the Philippines a few weeks ago. And I had to go into it not thinking about it, because if I'd thought about it, I wouldn't have known how to do it. And then, so I put it together with a PowerPoint, and I delivered all of it. And I found myself saying, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry. I'm so sorry, after every statistic I gave, because I didn't know what else to say. I mean, I was acutely aware and horribly aware that there I was, this white woman, privileged researcher, delivering this to the Philippines, and didn't want it to sound like me saying, oh, you poor things, isn't this awful? Or, I didn't want to be patronizing. I didn't want to be elitist. I didn't want to, but I didn't quite know how to communicate my sorrow at the same time as, trying to be alongside people as much as I could in a limited way. It was a real struggle. If we don't struggle with these things, then I think we're abandoning. And actually what we are doing, I'm sorry, Matt, I'm coming around maybe to where you were, which is, it's that willingness to struggle and to refuse that gaslighting and say, I am still doing this, and it hurts and it's difficult and I'm getting it wrong every single day and I'm still trying, but I'm willing to be uncomfortable with this. I'm willing to struggle. I'm willing to suffer. I mean, I can't help myself. I have to keep going back. I wish I could write as beautifully as this, Donna Haraway. Our task is to make trouble, to stir up potent responses to devastating events. That making trouble, And she says, in urgent times, many of us are tempted to address trouble in terms of making an imagined future safe, of stopping something from happening that looms in the future, of clearing away the present and the past to make futures for coming generations. Staying with the trouble doesn't require this relationship to the future or the past. It means being present and, feeling that grief and gravitas and depth and suffering and being touched by that suffering of the other and not shying away from that.
Brilliant. Thank you. Zoe, do you want to, we didn't have a plan. I don't know how you do a co-interview without to kind of, we've got some great questions coming in already. I've got a good question coming from Maria in a minute, but do you want to come into this first?
Yeah, just to speak briefly to the fact that I was the child of environmentalists in the 70s and grew up with this sense. My uncle invented the red list of endangered species, and I was aware from as soon as I can remember that the fish that we were eating was stolen from the seals and the dolphins. So I gave up fish age 3. So this has just been the theme of my life. And so all that time of being gaslit myself, of being like the weird kid in the corner who cared about the worms, and being aware throughout life that marginalizes you at the same time as you are being gaslit by mainstream society, by most of your friends and even the family, sometimes that are teaching you this. And now you have kids who are learning from teachers about the polar bears, but they're still saying, oh, but it's for you kids. You go home and you switch the light switch off, or you grow up and get a good education and you can fix this. And I know this because I grew up with this. And the thing is that you can't. I couldn't. We couldn't. I mean, and you're speaking about apologies. I feel every time I have a conversation with somebody anywhere younger than me, I just want to apologize for the failures, that we didn't fix this. I thought we could. I hoped we could. We thought we could. And then you have someone like Greta Thunberg coming along, who is just so, I don't know, like 10 or 100 times more so than I was, to the extent that she couldn't eat because it was being, the severity of the situation wasn't being tackled. And then, the parents were like, well, either we have a child who we listen to, or we're not going to have a child at all. And that the way that she has now spread and spun that story into what she's been able to do, I think is absolutely beautiful. But at the same time, I think it's actually really, really hard for all the young people inspired by her, because they can't all do that in their families. They can't take a year out of school. They can't get to the United Nations. And even if they could, they can see what happened, that she's done all this and still this is happening. And so this is the context in which I think this gaslighting idea is so important, because it's not just about universities and it's not just about schools. It's about our entire civilization. And why don't we talk about it? Why don't we talk about the situation that we are all in? And why don't we learn from the indigenous peoples and the cultures around the world who've already gone through this, who've already lost their forests, already lost their coral reefs, or lost their way of life as hunter-gatherers? There's so much that we can learn and share, and I don't understand why we don't talk about it. I don't know if you need to be neurodiverse or something to be somebody who can't help but talk about it. But I'm very glad that we are now talking about it, and I want to hear other people talk about it. So thank you.
Yeah. I don't think you have to be neurodiverse. I think you have to be clear about what's important and not get confused about, what's most important. Other things might be important, but it's about that clarity of what's most important. And that involves loss and it involves sacrifice. So because this is most important, these are less important. And it's an acceptance of that. I know a lot of young people actually who are, hugely inspired by Greta Thunberg and the other youth activist leaders. And what she's been very clear is about sharing that platform now with more and more young people, which is great and really powerful. But, you know, largely young people are quite inspired by her. And I've met quite a large number of young people who similarly have struggled to eat and have reduced the food they're willing to eat. And because they're often left embodying that guilt and that grief. And when you feel powerless or impotent or helpless or frustrated with rage and you turn it in on yourself, then you hurt yourself in that, you know, and it's hard to, actually, but this stuff is hard to swallow, let's face it, for any of us, right? Yeah. So I've met quite a lot of young people that way who say, you know, but again, what's hurting? What's hurting is the failure of adults to bear that, to act, and that we can do something about. You know, a 19-year-old said to me, tell me why I should want to live on a planet in a world that does not care. That was, it's as simple as that. And I could not answer that question directly. We found an answer. He found an answer in the end. But, you know, children are feeling not cared about collectively. I think we've singled out individual children to not care about through abuse and neglect and harm over the years. But now there's more of a collective abandonment of a generation and countries, whole countries, and whole species. You know, the ecocide movement is, you know, speaking to this and dealing with this. As are the young people who are going to court to, you know, say this is a violation of our human rights. There's this group of 6 children and young people in Portugal currently suing 33 European governments for failure in the European Court of Human Rights, saying that failing to take action on climate change is failing to uphold their human rights, and that it is akin to torture. So this is where we framed it as moral injury, failing to take action. So that's how you deal with gaslighting. You call it out, you name it, and you say, this is torture, this hurts, this is not okay. And, you know, they're saying this hurts, this is not okay. And the damage that's being done is you're failing to act, and this is torturing us, because not only are you calling a climate emergency, but you're failing to act with the gaslighting in the middle, saying, oh, don't worry, it's not that bad, you know, go back to school, we'll sort it. That's psychological torture. So for me, I connect this to, you know, creating trauma. This is very akin to abusing children psychologically, cognitively, mentally. It's not just children, it's any of us who care. But children are that little bit more vulnerable in that respect, aren't they? But not exclusively. I talk with as many distressed adults as I do children. It's just my research is with children. Yeah, it's torture, you know, that helplessness combined and that failure to do what's right. That's what the moral injury is about. It's a crisis of conscience. It's a moral act. We have a couple of brilliant questions coming in, don't we?
Yeah, thanks, Caroline.
Shall I have a bash and then?
I was going to invite Maria to put the question herself.
Go for it.
No, go for it. No, seize the reins by all means. Maria, I wondered if you'd like to unmute and just come in, and we'll let people come in to ask their question. Yeah.
Sure. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm coming to you from Toronto, Canada, and I just want to give a little bit of background. Hopefully, will illuminate my question a little bit. I've actually been a public school educator for over 20 years. And when I first started teaching about climate change 20 years ago, it wasn't in the curriculum formally, but I brought it in. I was actually confronted by a parent who worked in the extractive industry. As you know, in Canada, we have the tar sands projects, and we are an extractive economy. And that parent brought a tome of industry-produced research and said, you need to be teaching both sides of this issue. We don't know that it's the fossil fuels that are definitively causing climate change. And so that moment was a moment where I saw the tendrils of that industry come into my classroom and into my intimate choices as an educator, the pedagogy and the curriculum. And fast forward 7 years later, in another school, I was still doing this work, and I was doing some work that reconnects with Joanna Macy, and the young people became emotional. This was like a grade 7 class, so that would be about 12-year-olds, 12, 13. And at that time, the principal sort of called me into the office and said, you know, you're upsetting the children, and, you know, you need to rethink your pedagogies. And, you know, this is what prompted me to leave the classroom and do my research on the tension that faces educators, which is teach about the climate crisis. It is upsetting. Don't teach about it. We know that's not an option, but how to do that in ways that aren't politicized, also not possible in my mind. So how are we actually going to do this work? That's really the focus of my research. How are we going to engage this work in ways that support the well-being of young people? So I'm just wanting to get your perspective. I was so grateful for the study that you did. It's been really important to my own research. It's been very important in the work I'm trying to do to mobilize education systems within the Canadian context. But I'd love to hear, what are your thoughts on how, within the educational context, we can support learner well-being as we do this work of climate justice education?
Thank you. I'm so glad Matt, you were quite right. It's much nicer to hear your voice and hear how you're presenting this. It's great to hear your story. When I'm just going to be honest, 10 years ago, I would have communicated far more nuanced and subtly about a lot of this. We really don't have the time now. So, when we're asked to communicate in a balanced way, and every interview I give, people say, oh, please give us hope. Please be positive. Please be optimistic, I'm sure. Okay. Actually, I now hear that in my own head as, please lie to us. Just tell us it'll be all right. Don't scare us, right? There are ways, and I believe there are ways of telling that truth. Not speaking that truth is a betrayal. It's lying. And children know this. And that is more painful and wounding and betraying and abandoning than anything else. I've presented this research multiple times, 40, 50 times, at different groups over the last few months, and to mixed groups of adults and children. I've presented these results to 10-year-olds. And I watch the faces of the adults as I present this on Zoom, and I think, well, they're not going to ask me back. That's it. I've had it, because they look in horror. And then we ask the children, tell us what you think in the Zoom chat. And all the messages start coming in. I feel better. I feel relief. This is how I feel. Thank you. I feel happier. Because it resonates. It's the truth. It's how they feel. So, it's adults that can't bear it. Yeah. I'm so sorry that happened to you in school. I've managed to duck that so far, although I've been accused of traumatizing and terrifying children repeatedly. But what I've usually done is take an approach of, the children don't tell me that, the children thank me. So just listen to the children, right? But what I've done is take an approach of never talking about human extinction, never. Always talking about extinction in relation to the other, the animals, the whales. So I did a project with primary school children about 8 years ago, talking about, to discover, can we talk about extinction with 5-year-olds? Through whales, the relationship with whales, WHALES. And we spent weeks talking to them about whales, playing whale song, and we planted 2,500 crocus bulbs on the school playing field in the shape of the baby humpback whale, which then grew and then died back. So we were able to use that metaphor to talk about extinction and about fragility and vulnerability of nature. And the children drew whales and talked to us about vulnerability and fragility and identified their own vulnerability and fragility in relation to the whale. So I'm sneaky. We have an issue in the UK where we had a member of parliament table a motion in the House of Parliament to ban teachers and prosecute teachers for talking in schools about climate change because it was frightening the children, right? I don't think it got anywhere. But, what we're doing is activating adult defenses, adult terror, adult anxiety, and adult guilt and shame. And that's what we have to deal with. The children will be fine, actually, so long as we are nuanced about it. The children will be absolutely fine. It's the adult grief and guilt and shame that we have to address. And so they want to silence you because they don't want their guilt and shame activated. So, I would be saying that as much as I could. And I would be talking about that complexity of the intergenerational relationships and the necessity of reparation, the necessity of repair. There's a psychotherapeutic relationship when we've committed a harm or done damage or done something wrong, we can fix it. We say sorry. We have reparation. I don't know if you saw what Jacinta Ardern in New Zealand did recently for reparation. She went and sought forgiveness from the indigenous population for what the white New Zealand settlers did in stealing their children in the 1970s and putting them into orphanages. I don't know if you saw what she did. There was a beautiful ritual of reparation and apology, and she went and did the ritual, and they put a sack over her head, and she begged their forgiveness on behalf of the white folk. And it's worth watching. It's online. It's extraordinary. And people around the room are bursting into tears and sobbing because it's released that intergenerational wounding and harm. And that's the stuff I think we need to navigate with talking with children today. And I think we need to call out the grown-ups, if I'm honest. I'm also going to quote some children because I asked them some years ago, a group in Bath, sitting on the grass, what do you need from education and how do we provide this? What do you want? And they said to me, we need lessons in how to build boats, which plants are safe to eat, what are the names of trees, how to grow food. They said, and we need lessons in how to talk to adults about climate change, how to talk to our parents, and we need lessons in how to lobby politicians about climate change. So, I think it's about shifting the education system where possible so that the education system has some courage around this. But otherwise, it's a betrayal. It's lying, isn't it? I'd be really interested in having more conversations with you about this. So, but thank you. Thank you. And, you've got so much pain around the tar sands stuff. So painful.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's where the Indigenous nations here and the climate justice issues and how they're caught up, like the whole Canadian political project is really so much about land dispossession and extraction, despite the image, you know. So it's really truth before reconciliation is where we're at.
Yeah. But watch Jacinta Ardern as well.
I will.
I started apologizing to children years ago. I just couldn't not. And they try to stop me quite often and say, oh, no, you're one of the good guys. And I'm like, no. You have to tolerate this from me. You know, so I have that conversation with them. I say, look, you need to see an adult say sorry and not collapse and go, I'm so sorry, I'm the worst person on the planet, you know, or defend and say, you do something. You know, we need to show young people how to navigate the complexity of this and bear the grief and the guilt and the shame and the sorriness and not collapse, because that's reparative for us too, you know?
Absolutely. Really loved the question and the answer. Really did.
Yeah.
And I
Great
feel
question.
like
Thank you.
I don't know. I'm not speaking for anyone except myself, but I think there's a real sense for me that a lot of us are out here trying to pluck up the courage to navigate this stuff wholeheartedly where we live and where we work. And that what you said to Maria, all of that, but also something Jane picked up on earlier about your comment that if you could get in focus that gaslighting we spoke of is actually a form of abuse.
Yeah. Let
that put wind in your sails.
Yeah.
I wanted Richard's got a question that I wanted to lead into. Richard, I feel like I'm knowing you well enough to be cheeky enough to sort of lead on to your question and perhaps could bring you in to join this. But Richard's asked about young people. You asked that question, Richard, then I'd like to follow it with a more specific example I'd like to invite Caroline to speak to.
I just wonder if Caroline, if you have had conversations with that slightly older generation of young adults who are clearly deciding very specifically not to have children. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, very much. Couples are coming into psychotherapy now, struggling with this dilemma. You know, couples who love each other and don't always feel exactly the same way around this, but want to find a way through that difficulty together. And yes, well, I know young children as young as 9 and 10 who are making decisions they're not going to have children. I mean, that's extraordinary to be thinking that far ahead. I think one of the important things here for a lot of children and young people is it's not selfish grief and pain and loss that they're feeling. It's non-selfish. It's the grief and pain and loss on behalf of themselves and future generations. So there's a real sense of that grief extending generationally into the future, as well as around the world. In their teens and 20s, I'm hearing from significant numbers of young people that they feel that that's one of the few things they can do. Number one, it's a powerful act to choose that. A friend of mine, she's published this, so she won't mind me saying it, Eloise Mail, she said she's in her early 20s, so she's published herself as saying she loves children, but the only way to keep her future children safe is to keep them inside her body and not give birth to them in the world. That's her way of extending that love to her own future children, is to keep them safe there.
Do you think this is a relatively new phenomenon? Because, you know, the human race is extraordinarily good at being selfish and thinking about itself, and we create, political structures and everything else, economic structures that not only defend that but seem to facilitate that. And so I just wonder if your sense, coming from the psychological direction, is whether this feels like a real shift, feels like something new.
I don't think it's new, but I think it's emergent. So I talk about the ecological distress, grief, eco-anxiety as an emergent mental health difficulty, not a mental illness. It's an emotionally healthy response. So I think these things are all emergent, as in they're emerging from the underworld, from underground, to respond to the external reality that we're facing. I think they're emotionally healthy responses, but they're just coming from underground. All I can see is these kind of shoots coming out of the earth. As our awareness of what we're facing grows, these things are emerging to face this. But, similarly, it's about how to live and die well, as Donna Haraway says. I can't help keep quoting her. Our task is to learn how to live and die well with this. I've met parents who have imagined having to kill their children in the future to save them from starvation and save them from a terrified death by starvation. These things are all very similar. It's about thinking, how do we navigate something which is unprecedented, which humanity has never faced anything like this before, ever. So we don't know how to imagine our way through this. We don't know how to feel and find our way through this. People try to get comfort for themselves psychologically by trying to equate this with things like the Cuban Missiles Crisis or a nuclear war or a world war. But it's not the same. It's bigger, because with the Cuban Missiles Crisis or a nuclear war, you could imagine life on the other side of that crisis going back to how it was before. But with the climate crisis, we're already too far down that road, so we cannot go back to where we were before, because it's too late. It's too late to get back there. So we can rewrite the ending of the story, but only if we face the reality of where we're at today. If we don't face the reality of where we're at today, we won't be able to construct an ending that is healthy, because we're in fantasy that we still have choice. There's lots of things we don't have choice around now.
Thank you.
That's
Yeah,
lovely.
thank you.
That's a lovely, thanks, Richard. And that leads into, when you were talking at the beginning, I suddenly knew who I wanted to bring into this conversation. Wish I could actually bring her on screen as well. Because when we're talking about young people, I'm automatically thinking about children, but I'm also thinking about somebody right now in prison in the UK, and wanting to frame that response to these issues in the terms you're talking about. Some of you will know there's 10 people in the UK at the moment now in prison for climate activism, and the actions and the campaigns they're part of, the domain of argument actions is always full of argument, and that's probably a good thing, and there's lots about one campaign that others will critique, and we need to be critiquing each other. But mostly what I see in those 10 people now on 4 and 6 month prison terms, who I think are probably the front end of a wedge, I hope they are, is young adults mostly, or elder adults, trying to navigate exactly what you're talking about. Not just how do I face the young, but how do I face the past in a way? How do I face the present and the past as much as the future, with what this dangerous we are doing, this culture is doing, the dominant culture is doing. And I'm thinking about Emma Smart. Emma, forgive me if I get the details wrong, but she's on day 14 today of an unlimited hunger strike. She's on the hospital wing of her prison. She's an ecological scientist. She had some achievements to her name as an ecological scientist. She decided not to have children. she took the action she did, I presume, out of the kind of emotional desperation we're talking about. And I suppose, if it's not putting you on the spot, Caroline, I wondered, Ben, she's got another of her co-arrestees, Ben Hughes, I think his name is, they're both on hunger strike. And I wondered for Emma, and perhaps for the others, if there's anything that you'd like to say to them. I'll see if we can get this to them at some point. Maybe Wash is in there still.
Yes, I mean they are being extraordinarily courageous in putting themselves into the fire by standing in the fire and not protecting themselves from the pain and the grief and the anger and the frustration. So they're taking a powerful, courageous action and putting their bodies on the line, because that's all they've got left to communicate with is their own self. As activists, you know, there's been a lot of letter writing and lobbying and voting and campaigning, and when that fails, what are you left with is just yourself, to show through the way you use yourself that, and it's an extraordinary act of courage from the heart. It has to be. It's not an intellectual decision, I think. And it comes, you know, it's the ultimate act in powerfully saying, this is not okay. And I'm going to show you how much this is not okay. I'm not going to allow you to dominate my body, my experience in the world. I'm not going to succumb to that gaslighting, disallowing, disavowing, denial. This is the truth. This is the reality. So that's what you're left with if you are willing to put yourself into that. I think the majority of us do it a little bit. And she's doing it wholeheartedly and whole-bodily and, you know, from her soul. I admire that. I hope she's okay as well. I hope she's going to be okay in this, you know? I hope she doesn't martyr herself. I hope she's doing this from a spirit of, you know, love. And if she needs to step back at any point and recover, she's already done her bit. You know, I've heard it. I recognize this. I hope she doesn't abandon herself in that process, because that, I think, would be really sad and unnecessary. Maybe I'm hesitating as I'm saying that. There were some young people at COP, in the COP arena, who were, they're on record, it was a recorded conversation, who started to talk about the possibility in the future of mass suicide by young people as one of the only ways left to embody and to demonstrate and to show their grief and pain and helplessness and rage and despair. Pay attention. And this is on record. It was on a recording at COP, right? So my fear is that people will be left with nowhere else to go. And I would hate that to happen.
I'm feeling, it's interesting, a kind of knee-jerk unease, and then a sense of, no, this is the right way to end our conversation, actually. Because
I can't hear you, Matt.
Sorry, I'm talking too quietly again. I keep defaulting to mumble. Sorry. Yeah. I feel like these conversations often look for an uptick to end. You know, they look for a kind of let's end on a good note. And I don't know if I even want to end on a good note. I feel like I want to end on the honesty of what you brought into the room and the kind of loving honesty of it as well. That sense, both in calling out the gaslighting, but also affirming that we're not in a comfortable place with this, and no reason to expect to be in a comfortable place with it this time next year, and that we're going forward into that together. A phrase that came up today, talking with Dugaldheim, who we've had this conversation with much over the years, is just about being good company. You know, that's one of the things we can do, and that's an intergenerational thing, isn't it? It's maybe being elders is part of it, but also being just being our raw kind of bumbling, barely good enough selves. You know, just learning to be good company.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying, Matt. I don't want to do the "but there's hope" message at the end either, but I appreciate what you're saying. You have a good poem, and but I do want to give people something to hang this on, like to bring us back to meaning at the end, which isn't about making it better, but it is about giving it meaning. Does that sound all right?
Perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Because, you know, I know this stuff, I feel this stuff, and I'm okay. And I'm okay because I know this stuff and I feel this stuff. So I feel authentic in that I'm okay with it. And it's not okay, and I'm lucky because I get to communicate about this, which gives me meaning for this as well. But I'm okay with not being okay. And that was the opening question in the Philippines webinar. And we all said, no, we're okay with not being okay. I just want to read something from a young person. When this research got released, emails started arriving from teenagers all over the world, which really is like the ultimate, really. And I just want to read you what she said, because I think I'm going to give it as a message to you from her. I have her permission. She said, I'm only a single private person studying in Germany, but I want to thank you for this research about climate anxiety amongst young people around the world. What the study reveals makes me, for the first time ever, feel that I am not alone with the future and climate anxiety that I feel every day. She said, I still don't know quite where to go to learn about this, but she considers this study as an important step for young people to emotionally connect and visually realize that no one of us is alone with this huge issue. So I just wanted to give you her words, because
maybe we should let her be the last word. That feels like
I'm happy to.
Good place to end. And I was going to read a poem, but I am also aware that we're bouncing along now. Our friends at Onka and Persephone, Pearl and others are about to welcome people in a quarter of an hour for an interdependence ritual to celebrate, to mark, I suppose is a better word, this 10th Remembrance Day for Lost Species. So I've just put the Zoom into the chat there. The last message from me there is from a chat. Apparently I'm talking quietly again, which is telling me to speak up. And but also just to thank you, Caroline, for bringing us full circle, because this whole 2-year cycle spread into 2.5 years with a pandemic in the middle of it began a few yards from here with a conversation with Richard in this canteen where I'm sitting. We've come and gone from it since, and I feel like there's been a real alignment of the stars in coming back with you on Remembrance Day for Lost Species and bringing these things together here. And for those that want a good poem to speak to this, because many of us come to this as artists, W.S. Merwin's Thanks is the poem that was on my mind then and is on my mind now. But instead of reading it now, I want to give people the 15-minute break we promised and encourage you to come over to Onka, to Bizu's interdependence ritual, and yeah, just a thank you from all of us, Caroline, and to Zoe and to Richard and all those who've been involved in helping this happen this evening, and the great questions. So thanks
Thank
and
you.
goodbye.
Thank
so
you,
much.
everyone. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.